This is a presentation of OneLogin training.
Welcome to configuring the G Suite app connector, which connects your users to what is now known as Google Workspace. There are 5 main topics we'll be covering in this training, which we have divided into 2 videos. In the first video, we'll start with an overview of what we want to configure so we have an idea of where we are trying to get to. Then, we'll just add in the basic app connector and then configure it for provisioning. Provisioning is a feature that ensures that user accounts will exist in your Google Workspace before your users actually try to log into Google. If provisioning is available, you always want to configure it before you enable single sign-on to ensure your users have accounts within the app before they try to log in. The second video will take a look at how to configure single sign-on so your users can log in to Google Workspace from OneLogin. And finally, you're going to want to understand the difference between our app connector and our G Suite directory connector so you can know when to use one versus the other. First, an overview of what we're going to be setting up. Always good to know where you're going before you start out on a journey. Our first goal is to enable provisioning. With provisioning enabled, a user can be automatically created in the target applications such as Google Workspace. Technically here, we're creating a user in the Google user directory and licensing them for Google Workspace. Then, whenever a user is added to the app connector, either manually or automatically through a role the user is assigned to, the user will automatically be added to Google. If you are configuring provisioning and have the ability to use provisioning based upon your licensing, we always recommend configuring provisioning before you configure single sign-on so that users have accounts in the applications before they try to log into those applications. So here's an example of how provisioning, again, if you have the capabilities and it's enabled, can work. A new employee, Misty, starts at our law firm, OneLogin. Mappings fire off when the new user record is created in OneLogin, and one of the mappings sees that Misty's email contains onelogins.com. The mapping then automatically assigns her to the Google Workspace role. The Google Workspace role is associated with the G Suite app connector. Thus, Misty is assigned to the G Suite app connector. With provisioning enabled, OneLogin would then connect to Google Workspace to make sure that Misty has a user account within Google Workspace. If, say, Misty's attributes changed, perhaps she's promoted to junior partner, those updates would then automatically be sent through to Google Workspace. And if Misty leaves the firm, she will be disabled within OneLogin, and because provisioning is enabled, she can also be disabled within Google Workspace. Once we have provisioning fully configured, our final goal is to configure an end-user experience where they will log into the OneLogin portal, click on, say, an app tile that we created for G Suite, and then automatically get directed to and logged into Google Workspace. So first, we need to add our app connector. Need to do is add that G Suite app connector. Hopefully, pretty easy to do. From the OneLogin admin UI, go to Applications, then click on the Add Apps button. Type in G space Suite in the search box. Don't forget the space. And select the connector that is simply called G Suite. There are a few others there. They're for very specific use cases. We are focusing on the G Suite app connector. We're going to be configuring G Suite to use SAML authentication. So just make sure that the radio button is selected at the bottom for SAML and click Save. You'll also want to disable that visible in portal option so users don't see the connector until you have it fully configured and ready for them. One thing to note about the G Suite connector, in order for our app connector to provision users, they need to have a mailbox in Google Workspace. Therefore, if you're not using Google Workspace as your email solution, maybe you're using something like Office 365 for email, then you'll need to choose the G Suite 2, which has Drive in the parentheses, connector. Our purpose here, we're going to focus on that main G Suite app connector. So let's see how to go in and add the app connector. All right, so of course to add the app connector in, we're going to have to go to the admin UI, click on applications and click add app. First thing we want to do is search. So G space suite, help us out there. Again, there are quite a few of these. Most of them are used to connect to maybe, a sub component like Hangouts or just the admin console. For 99% of the time, you're just going to be selecting this G Suite one here. Simple naming. The G Suite 2, as I mentioned, is what you would want to use if you're not using G Suite for email functionality. But our case, we're going to focus on, again, the one that is used about 99% of the time. So I'm going to click on G Suite here. I might want to change the name. For example, maybe my users want to know it as Google Workspace. So maybe I will change it to Google Workspace here. I could upload a new icon if I want to. Right now, I'm just going to save this guy. And voila, I have my new app connector. So again, general best practice might be to make it invisible for a while until we have it fully configured and we're ready for our users to actually see it in the portal. So just kind of a nice thing to do first thing off the bat so you don't forget to do it later on when you're like starting to do provisioning and such. So I'm going to do that right now. Click save, and basically I'm done with adding in my app connector. As we already stated, it is always important to configure provisioning, if available, before you configure single sign-on for your app connectors. So first, we're going to need to make sure we can connect to Google's API. This means we need to fill in the domain we configured for our Google Workspace. Click Save, then click the Authenticate button. Once you click on the Authenticate button, you'll get a pop-up with a link to G Suite. If you click on the link, you'll be prompted to allow access to users and groups in Google Workspace. You need to be logged into your Google Workspace account with an administrator account in order to have the appropriate level of access. Next, this one's somewhat optional, but would be to check the Provision Entitlements checkbox on the Configuration tab. This will ensure that you can put users into Google Groups within Google Workspace through our provisioning feature. If you don't want to be able to do this, then you can leave the checkbox clear. Once you have checked the Provision Entitlements checkbox and click Save, just need to go over to the Provisioning tab and check the Enable Provisioning checkbox. Click Save again. Next step here actually initiates a connection between the app connector and your Google Workspace account using the API connection you just enabled. It really doesn't seem like it's doing anything at all, but it is connecting to Google Workspace and querying for existing values like what Google Groups have you created so that it can pull those into your OneLogin account. Once they are pulled in, you can assign your users to one or more of these groups during provisioning. So we've looked at the basic steps needed to enable provisioning. Wasn't all that hard. But before we go on, we want to take a few moments to look at some of the provisioning options. The first option, require admin approval before this action is performed, controls whether or not a OneLogin administrator needs to come in and manually approve particular types of provisioning tasks. For example, with the Create User checkbox checked, Every time a user is added to the G Suite app connector, they will not automatically be created in Google Workspace. A OneLogin administrator will have to approve their creation, say through going the Users menu and going to the provisioning page. If you do not wish to have to approve every user creation, you can clear this checkbox. When initially setting up your app connector, we do recommend being as cautious as possible and requiring approval for all tasks: create, update, and delete. Once you are sure provisioning is working properly, then you can come and perhaps disable admin approval for one or more of them. The option below the admin approval section controls what happens when a user is deleted from OneLogin or removed from the app connector. By default, OneLogin will tell Google Workspace to actually do nothing to the user in Google Workspace. The other actions available in the dropdown are delete or suspend. We usually recommend you change this to suspend. The last option controls what will happen when a user is suspended in OneLogin, and the default is to suspend them in Google Workspace. So in this case, the default is fine. The other option would be to do nothing. So basically on this page, the only change we really recommend you make during initial setup is to change the do nothing to suspend for the when users are deleted in OneLogin or the user's app access is removed. Perform the action below option. Let's go enable provisioning now. All right. So we added in the app connector. Now we're going to go do that provisioning piece, of course. And I'm going to go to Configuration tab first, type in the domain that I registered over in G Suite. So I got onelogintrainme.com over there. I'm going to save that. And then I'm going to want to come back to my Configuration tab. And again, first main step is enabling the API access. So that's where I'm going to want to click on this Authenticate. It's going to ask me about going to G Suite to do the authorization. Make sure I'm choosing the right account here. And again, the account that I'm logged into G Suite with at this point has administrative access to Google Workspace. So I'm going to be giving that administrative access, using it to authorize access to my users and groups, basically. And voila, I have enabled my API access via OAuth. Next step, pretty simple. Go over to provisioning here and click on Enable Provisioning. Save. Easy peasy. All right. And then last little bit here that we had mentioned as far as like basic configuration is clicking on this refresh button underneath entitlements. Again, what it's going to do is take that API access, connect over to Google Workspace, and actually query to see like what kind of Google groups do you have. So now I can start assigning out those Google groups from OneLogin so that when users are created into G Suite, or Google Workspace, they can be automatically assigned to particular Google groups. So just clicking on the link doesn't look very satisfying. How do we know things were successful? There are a couple things we can do, but one thing you can do pretty easily is just go to your events viewer up here underneath the activity menu, and you should see a refresh entitlements got started and a refresh entitlements got finished. So I know that it was successful. If I don't see the finish part, then something probably went wrong. And usually it's with that OAuth step. That's typically where things go wrong. So now we've got basic provisioning enabled. Now we want to map up what user fields or values we're going to send across as parameters during the provisioning process when users are created or updated within the application. First, you want to make sure you have the correct user fields matched within the required parameters section. For example, the default value for the email address is to just send over the name part of the user's email address within OneLogin. This works fine because it simply adds it to the SMTP domain that you registered with Google Workspace to create a full email address. If the name part of their email address isn't what you want over in Google addresses, then you might want to change that. But again, here, usually the defaults are just fine. With optional parameters, those ones you're going to want to take a look at. Okay? So, for example, you can assign users to a default Google group. Just click on Google Groups field, or the Groups field, and choose the group or groups you want them to go into. That list actually got populated when we clicked on that refresh entitlements thing over when we enabled provisioning. Once you select the groups that you want, make sure to check the checkbox, Include in User Provisioning. That'll ensure that these group values will get sent over as part of the provisioning process. You can also set other fields like their department field. And might be easy enough, just match the department field over in Google Workspace to the department field that exists within OneLogin. So you can just choose department from that drop-down. Again, make sure to check the checkbox, Include in User Provisioning, and click Save. So let's go take a look at how to do this in real life. Now let's go take a look at setting up our parameters that will be sent across over to Google Workspace as part of our provisioning process. So we've got those required parameters up here at the top. Again, for the most part, unless their email address is going to really look different than the email address that we have for them in OneLogin. Not going to make many changes here, but optional parameters you do want to think about. So like, what are the fields that you want populated for your users over in Google Workspace? So here, for example, you want their department field populated with whatever the department field is populated with over in OneLogin. One of those user fields, those standard user fields, in fact. So I'm going to match department I'm sending over to Google Workspace with the department field from OneLogin, and check the checkbox, Include in User Provisioning. Then, of course, click Save. So now we can see that it's enabled. Or maybe I want to assign my users to a default Google group. Remember that refresh entitlement step that we did in the last demo? Well, here is where I can see those Google groups that got brought over. These did not exist over in OneLogin. These got pulled in from Google Workspace when we clicked on Refresh Entitlements. So we'll make everybody part of the company news Google group and include in user provisioning. Click Save. So depending upon what user fields I have populated within OneLogin itself, I can go through and match up these fields. So for example, if I want the manager sent over, it's already matched to the user manager field in OneLogin, but I just need to make sure it's included in user provisioning. Okay, makes life a little bit easier. Now just click Save. And we've configured our parameters. When we match values from OneLogin to parameters on the Parameter tab, we were setting defaults for all the users that we were creating in Google Workspace. However, we don't always want all users to be set with the same values. Therefore, we can create rules. Rules are simple if-then statements that are created at the app connector level. They look at users' attributes and assign the users values within the application. Here we can see that all users assigned to the G Suite app connector that are in the engineering department, thus department equals engineering, will be assigned to the appropriate Google group over in Google Workspace. Thus, underneath Actions, you see Set Groups in G Suite to engineering. So let's go see how the rules work. Now, again, those parameters only used for setting really the defaults for all of my users. So for example, we assigned all of our users to the Google group called Company News over here, right? But we have some other groups here. It's just not everybody needs to belong to all these groups. So for example, I have an engineering group. Maybe I just want my engineers to belong to the engineering Google group. That's where rules can come in. Again, simple if-then statements. So I'm going to add a rule here, call it engineering group. Hey, look, might have done this before. And I'm going to add in a condition. The condition in this case is going to look at their department field, right? Makes sense. If their department equals engineering, then assign them to, and notice there are lots of these things that we can do here at this point, but just going to scroll on down till I see groups, assign them to the engineering Google group. Click Save. All I need to do. So now when we're provisioning, any users whose department field equals engineering will automatically be assigned to the engineering Google group over in G Suite. And of course, click Save. Now, we really want to test this to make sure it's working. Remember, we do not want to enable SSO until we make sure provisioning is working, because we do not want our users trying to log in to Google Workspace from OneLogin unless they have an account in Google Workspace. So at this point, you can go create your Google Workspace role and attach your new Google Workspace connector to it. Create a couple of user accounts to test with. One that isn't in Google Workspace yet, and maybe another that you manually create over in Google. This way, you can test both creating and updating a user through provisioning. Assign both users to the new Google Workspace role. You can do this manually for now, or just manually assign the users to the new app connector that you just created. Once the users are assigned to the role, ask and check the questions here, like, are the users being created and updated as expected? Are the fields being sent over? If you created any rules, were the users, assigned to the Google groups correctly, right? Those are the things that you want to make sure are flowing correctly over to Google Workspace from your app connector. So let's go do a little testing. All right, so we have our app connector. We have enabled it for provisioning. Now we need to assign it to our users, or at least one of the users, to test this out. So we could assign it directly to a user, but best practice is to create a role, associate the application with the role, and then assign users to the role. Especially because you can automatically assign users to roles using what we call mappings, which we'll look at in the next demo. But first, let's create the role, Google Workspace role, and associate it with the Google Workspace app connector we just created. Now I can add my user to the role directly from here, or I could go over to the user record and assign it from the application tab, which is what I'm going to do. So got my Mr. Blake Cat here. I'm going to go to Applications, going to select the Google Workspace role, got the pretty green check mark there, and click Save User. So that should be it. Should create my user over there, like have their department filled in with engineering. So let's go see, did we create it? No. Something go wrong? No. Actually, it's going as designed. Well, why was it designed that way? Well, remember in the Wayback Machine, when we created the app connector, we had talked about some of these other options on the provisioning tab. In particular, require admin approval before this action is performed, i.e. create, update, or delete a user. So it's waiting for my approval. as designed. How can I give my approval? Well, I can do it directly from the user record where I just was. Go check out Mr. Blake Hat here, applications, and notice it says pending. If I click on pending, I have the ability to approve from here. If I have a whole bunch of these that I need to approve, I could also go to the provisioning page under the users menu. And I'll see create Blake Hat in Google Workspace here, also pending and approve. Cool. So it might take a second or so. I'm going to refresh a couple of times. I'm looking for Blake Hat was created down here. I've been torturing him for a while today. There he goes. So Blake Hat provisioned in Google Workspace. So now I should expect to go see his user record over here. Doesn't always work if I refresh on that page for some reason. Kind of annoys me. So I'm going to go back to the main Google admin page, then click on users. And I'm going to refresh a couple more times as I wait for it to come through. Sometimes it takes a moment or so. Let's see if we can sneak up on him. And there he is. All right, so we created Blake Hat, and let's go take a look at him. So we've got him in here, got his first name, his last name, notice department equals engineering. Yay! Looks like he was provisioned, at least created successfully. So I'm going to think to myself, his department equals engineering. Wasn't there something else that should have happened to him if his department equals engineering? Well, yeah, actually there was. Remember when we created and configured our Google Workspace app connector, we added in a rule. Dun, da, da, da. And the rule says if department contains or equals engineering, then assign this user to the Google group called engineering. And in fact, there's another Google group that he should belong to. Remember our parameters. This is a default for all the users that should be created over there, that they should be added to the company news Google group. So is that done successfully? Let's go check out Blake again. He wasn't assigned to any groups. So what happened? Well, I could go and let's see. Does the rule really apply to him? Was that correct? Like I could test these rules out. Notice like if I go type in Blake's name, click check. Well, no, it would have applied to him. So what happened? Well, the thing that you need to know or remember, because again, I did say it, is that a Google group is considered to be what is called an entitlement, which basically means some sort of property that controls what a user can do within the application. So the G Suite app connector by default does not provision entitlements. Provisions those other fields like just the department he belongs to, but not values like Google groups. So in order to ensure that he gets assigned to company news and engineering, I need to check this checkbox over here. So I could have done that a while back when we initially enabled provisioning, but I really wanted you to understand why you need to check it. So I sort of brought it up here during the testing process. So check that, click save. So now we've told the system we actually want you to send some different info over. And in fact, if we go look at Blake, we're going to want to, I'm going to go look at my rules actually. What we want to do is sort of resend information. So I'm going to do this guy over here. I'm going to do a little reapply entitlement mappings. So basically what it should do is like look at my users, see do they match any of these attributes, kind of resend those over. All right, let's see if that does the update that we want. So let's go look back over at Blake. Let's refresh him. Still doesn't belong to any group. So we're going to trigger a change just for Blake. So basically do like a little re-provisioning of him. So I just put a space in there and click Save User. It's kind of a fun way to do this. I can get rid of the space now. Get rid of the space, thank you. All right, so I'm gonna kind of trick it into seeing that there's been an update on him. So now I should see that there's a change waiting to happen, pending here, and I'm going to approve it. And notice groups, company news, and engineering are part of now what it's gonna figure out to send over there. So again, when I am setting up provisioning, definitely want to check that enable and provisioning entitlements checkbox there on the configuration tab. Did not do it here because I wanted to kind of prove to you how important it was if you wanted to do things like assign a user to a Google group. So we've now approved that change to go over. Let's make sure we got everything refreshed over here. And now it says he's a member of 2 groups, company news and engineering. So now we know that provisioning works. If all the testing works out, you can now assign your users that are going to be using Google Workspace to that Google Workspace role. Again, we can do this manually by just adding them to the role, or we can do it automatically by using a mapping. Mappings are actually like those rules that we looked at before. They're simple if-then statements, and they look at a user's attribute. The difference here is the actions. A mapping will change user attributes basically within OneLogin. In this case, we're going to assign users to a role within OneLogin. So we create a mapping and say the mapping says if their email address contains onelligans.com, then set their role to be the Google Workspace role. So let's check out how to assign our roles via a mapping. All right, so now we know the provisioning works. Let's do the automatically assigning our user to that role that we created using a mapping. So mappings are like those rules that we looked at. So we're going to call this Google Workspace mapping, and we are going to base this upon their email address having a particular SMTP domain in it. And let's use, not my email address, but OneLoginTraining.com. And we're going to say set role to Google Workspace role. Click Save. Okay, so now we can go and kind of check this out. We could type in some username in here, like Gloria. Would it apply to her? Yep, it'll apply to her because she's gloria.arias@onelogintraining.com. What if we do it to Blake, who we manually assigned to this role? Actually shouldn't apply to him because he's demo.com, so it wouldn't apply to him. Fine. All right, so we create our mapping over here. Now, does this mean now my users are all automatically assigned to that Google Workspace role? At least all the users that match that criteria? No, still only Blake over here. The only way that my current users will be able to be assigned via that mapping is if I do this little step over here, reapply all mappings. So what this wants to do is look at all my users and see which attributes in this list they match, and then based upon whether they match or no, apply the action, like setting their role equal to Google Workspace. So it's a job that might take a little while to kind of run in the background depending upon how many users you have, how many mappings you have, but in this case, it took less than a minute. It's already completed. So now, if I go look at my list of users, I should see Brian at OneLoginTraining.com has been applied to Google Workspace role. Claire is part of the Google Workspace role, etc., etc. So only those that match the OneLoginTraining.com criteria there for their email are assigned to Google Workspace role. Now, have they automatically been created over here in Google Workspace? No. Why not? I mean, I have provisioning enabled. Well, it's that same waiting for approval thing, right? So if I go to my provisioning page over here, I will see they're all waiting for me to go through and approve, which I am not going to do at the moment. But we do know that we have successfully assigned it. And if this were my production environment, I would go through and want to approve all these folks, just to make sure that they do have accounts in Google Workspace before I go on to the next step where I'm going to enable single sign-on. This concludes part 1 of configuring the G Suite app connector. Please continue on to part 2 so you can see how to enable single sign-on.
This is a presentation of OneLogin Training.